It all started so innocently. Our golden retriever Daisy had always been my walking companion. Rain or shine, we'd stroll through the tree-lined streets of our suburban neighborhood, her leash in my hand, her tail wagging happily as she sniffed every bush and lamp post. But about 2 months ago, my husband Mark started volunteering to take her on the evening walks. First, I thought it was sweet. Mark wasn't the most outdoorsy type, but he and Daisy seemed to have a bond that I couldn't help but admire. He'd come home from work, change into his sneakers and call for her. She'd come bounding into the hallway, leash in her mouth, and they'd disappear into the twilight. I appreciated the gesture, one less chore for me, but as the weeks wore on, something began to gnaw at me. Mark started staying out longer. What had initially been short, 20-minute strolls stretched into hour-long excursions. He didn't have a pattern either. Sometimes he'd come home at 8, other times closer to 10. When I'd ask him about it, he'd shrug and say Daisy had a lot of energy that day, or that he got caught up chatting with another dog owner at the park. The first rail crack appeared one night when Daisy came home without him. I'd been reading on the couch when I heard her scratching at the door. I opened it to find her panting and wagging her tail as if nothing was wrong. But there was no sign of Mark. My chest tightened. Grabbing my phone, I called him. No answer. I texted. No reply. Panic set in. I threw on a jacket, clipped Daisy's leash back on, and retraced what I thought might have been their usual route. I scoured the dimly lit streets, calling his name, checking around the park, even asking a couple of joggers if they'd seen a man walking a dog. Nothing. Just as I was about to call the police, my phone buzzed. Sorry, the text read. Ran into an old friend and lost track of time. Be home soon. He arrived 15 minutes later, looking sheepish. I didn't mean to worry you, he said, leaning down to scratch Daisy's ears. It won't happen again. But it did. Over and over. Each time there was an excuse, traffic, running into someone he knew, Daisy being stubborn. And each time the pit in my stomach grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. So I did what I swore I'd never do. I went online and bought a GPS tracker for Daisy's collar. The package arrived 3 days later. That evening, while Mark was getting ready for the walk, I discreetly clipped the device onto her collar. My hands were shaking, my breath uneven. I felt guilty, even paranoid, but I couldn't stop myself. Something about the way he kissed my forehead before leaving that night felt performative, rehearsed. Once they were gone, I opened the tracking app on my phone. The little blue dot moved steadily down our street, through the park, and onto a trail that led to the edge of town. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, as the dot stopped near a secluded parking lot. For 30 minutes it didn't move. My imagination ran wild. Was he meeting someone? Doing something illegal? My mind conjured up every worst-case scenario, and before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my keys and drove to the location. I parked a block away, not wanting to be seen, and crept toward the lot. There, beneath a flickering street lamp, I saw Mark leaning against his car. Daisy sat obediently at his feet, her leash tied to a nearby bench. But he wasn't alone. A woman was standing next to him. She was tall, with dark hair that caught the light as she laughed at something he said. I couldn't hear their conversation, but the way she touched his arm, the way he leaned closer to her, it was intimate, familiar. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My chest ached, my hands clenched into fists. I wanted to storm over there, confront him, demand answers. But instead I turned and walked back to my car, my vision blurred with tears. At home I waited for him to return. When he finally walked through the door, I pretended to be asleep. Daisy jumped onto the bed, nuzzling into my side as if sensing my turmoil. Mark slipped into bed beside me, his arm draping across my waist like nothing had happened. The next day I confronted him. I told him about the GPS tracker, about what I saw. For a moment he looked stunned, then angry. You're spying on me? He snapped, as if I were the one who had betrayed him. But then his anger softened into something worse. Guilt. He sat down heavily on the couch, rubbing his temples. It's not what you think, he said, his voice trembling. And then the truth came out. The woman was an old colleague, someone he'd had feelings for before we met. They'd reconnected by chance a few months ago, and it had started innocently, catching up, reminiscing. But over time the boundaries blurred. He swore nothing physical had happened, but the emotional betrayal was clear. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. "I didn't want to hurt you." I wanted to scream, to throw something, to tell him that not telling me was worse, that sneaking around had shattered the trust we'd spent years building. But all I could do was sit there, silent and numb. The days that followed were a blur of arguments, tears, and half-hearted apologies. Mark promised to cut ties with her, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to fix things. I wanted to believe him. I still loved him despite everything, but a part of me wondered if we'd ever recover. Daisy still needed her walks, but now I was the one holding the leash again. As we wandered through the quiet streets, I couldn't help but think about how fragile trust is, how quickly it can be broken. Mark had taken more than just an evening stroll with our dog. He'd taken a piece of my heart, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. It all started so quietly, so innocently, the kind of thing that never makes you think twice until you're already drowning in it. My husband, Mark, had always been the type to work late, to get lost in his office or his hobbies when the evening came. But then, without warning, he began to take Daisy, our golden retriever, on the nightly walks. I never thought much of it at first. Mark had always been fond of her, but he was never the one to walk her. It was my routine, my time to clear my head, to escape from the chaos of the day. First I thought it was sweet. Mark seemed to enjoy the fresh air, the quiet of the night. I'd watch them leave together. Mark in his sneakers, Daisy pulling eagerly at the leash, her tail wagging like a pendulum. They'd walk down our street, the soft sound of paws and footsteps fading into the distance. It was nice. I didn't mind it. I appreciated that he was doing it, that he was spending time with her. He'd come back at first after about 20 minutes, sometimes 30, but as the days passed, something started to change. The walks grew longer, creeping into the hour mark, then beyond. And it wasn't just that he was gone longer, it was the way he'd come back, distracted, almost aloof. He'd give Daisy a quick pet, say something like, "She was full of energy tonight," and then retreat to his office or the kitchen, like he didn't want to talk about it. I started asking him about it. "Everything okay with the walks? You're gone a little longer than usual," I'd say casually, as if I wasn't already picking at the thread in my mind. Mark would always give a shrug, a little chuckle. "Oh, I ran into a neighbor," or "Daisy wanted to keep going. You know how it is." And I'd smile, nod, but something in his tone didn't sit right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there like a shadow hanging over the words. Then one night things shifted for good. It was a Thursday, just like any other, I thought. Daisy and Mark went for their evening walk as usual. I was curled up on the couch with a book, listening to the sounds of the world outside, when I heard Daisy scratching at the door. I jumped up, expecting Mark to follow her in, but when I opened the door, only Daisy stood there, panting heavily, her leash dangling from her collar. No Mark. I looked down at her, confusion and a sinking feeling creeping over me. She was acting like everything was normal, wagging her tail, but I couldn't shake the odd chill that settled in my chest. I called Mark immediately. No answer. I texted. Nothing. My mind was racing. Maybe something happened to him, I thought, trying to calm myself. Maybe he got caught in traffic or stopped to help someone. But then the doubt started to creep in. What if he was choosing not to answer? What if there was something more going on? I put my shoes on, grabbed Daisy's leash again, and headed out to retrace their steps. I kept walking, calling Mark's name in the darkness, scanning every face I passed, asking strangers if they'd seen a man walking a dog. It felt like a dream, an endless loop of worry and unanswered questions. When I didn't find him, I finally called the police. They were kind, understanding, but by the time they arrived, Mark was already back. He didn't even seem to realize the weight of the situation. "Sorry," he said as he walked in, his eyes avoiding mine. "Ran into an old friend. Lost track of time. I'm sorry I worried you." I didn't ask any more questions that night. He was home, he was safe. I wanted to believe him, but my gut told me there was more to the story. I couldn't stop thinking about Daisy, how she had returned alone. She didn't seem upset, didn't act like anything was wrong. But I knew she wasn't stupid. She knew something I didn't. The days after that, the walks continued. Longer later. He never really explained why they were taking so long. I asked again one evening casually, "Mark, you're really out there for over an hour. Is everything okay?" He shrugged it off with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She's just enjoying herself. I'm just walking her more. She's been energetic. It wasn't just the time. It was how he said it. The way his words didn't match his body language. And I realized I'd been ignoring the obvious. I wasn't stupid. I knew what was happening. There were no more excuses. And so, I did something I never thought I would. I went online, found a small GPS tracker and ordered it. It came a few days later, and I knew what I had to do. That evening, after Mark and Daisy had left, I clipped the tracker to Daisy's collar. My hands shook as I did it. I felt guilty, paranoid, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know. When they left, I opened the app on my phone. At first, the little blue dot stayed within the familiar area, down the block to the park. But then it started to move farther, into a part of town I didn't recognize. I watched frozen, as it stopped at a location near a small, dimly lit parking lot. My heart pounded. For the next 30 minutes, the dot remained in the same place, not moving. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. I had to see for myself. Without thinking, I grabbed my car keys, told myself it was a mistake, that I was being ridiculous, but I drove. I parked a few blocks away, trying to keep my distance, and then walked toward the parking lot. And there he was. Mark. Leaning against his car. But he wasn't alone. A woman stood next to him, laughing at something he said. Her hand resting on his arm in a way that made my stomach twist. She was tall with dark hair, a tight jacket that showed off her figure. They were too close. Mark was laughing too, his posture relaxed, his hand brushing against hers as if it were natural, as if it was normal. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Daisy was sitting by his feet, but she didn't seem to matter at all in that moment. My whole body went cold. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look at them anymore. I turned around and walked back to my car, not knowing how I was going to face him when he came home. The drive back was a blur. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew now. There was no denying it. He came in late that night, apologetic. Sorry, I lost track of time again, he said as if it was nothing, as if I didn't already know. Daisy was in her usual spot, tail wagging, totally oblivious to the storm I was trying to suppress inside. I didn't confront him right away. I let the silence settle, let the weight of the truth sink in. I didn't need him to explain. I knew exactly what had been happening, and I couldn't bring myself to ask any more questions. The next day I did confront him. The words came out in a rush, barely controlled. I told him what I knew, what I had seen. The truth was a slap in the face. He tried to deny it at first, but it didn't matter. His guilt, his shame, his excuses, it was all too much. He said she was just a friend, that it didn't mean anything, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But the look in his eyes, the way his voice cracked, told me everything. I should have been angry, and I was. But more than that, I felt empty, like someone had hollowed me out from the inside. Daisy kept staring at me, as if she could sense my heart breaking. She had been there the whole time, watching him walk away from me, from us. Now, I walked her every night just like I used to. But the walks felt different. Each step felt heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the leash in my hand. It was the weight of knowing that I'd been walking through the dark, pretending everything was fine, when it had all been falling apart behind my back. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, each one sharper than the last. Mark tried to apologize in every way he knew how. He told me that it hadn't meant anything, that the woman, Sophie, was just a former coworker, someone he used to talk to years ago. He said he'd gotten caught up in the nostalgia, in the familiar comfort of their conversations. But even as he spoke, I could feel the distance growing between us. It wasn't just his guilt that had put a wall between us. It was the betrayal, the lie, the knowing that he had been able to hide this from me for so long, that he had been able to walk away from our life together, even if just for a few stolen moments. And Daisy. I kept thinking about Daisy. She had always been so eager to walk with him, so happy to be by his side. But now I could see her differently. I could see the way her eyes would follow Mark's every movement when he got home, as though she knew something I didn't. I watched her, her innocent joy and loyalty, and I couldn't help but wonder if she had been a silent accomplice in his betrayal. Had she known all along? Had she seen the way he looked at Sophie when they stood together in the parking lot? I began to feel like I was living in a twisted version of my own life, where nothing made sense anymore. Every time Mark came home, he'd try to act like things were back to normal, But I couldn't bring myself to pretend. I couldn't bring myself to smile at his jokes, to kiss him goodnight like I used to. It felt like I was lying to myself and I couldn't do it anymore. I kept up appearances for Daisy. I didn't want her to feel the weight of the tension in the house. She still needed her walks. We still had our routines, but they were different now. I started taking her on walks alone, walking down the same streets, but now everything felt heavier. Like the sidewalks themselves were laden with the weight of everything that had happened. I'd walk for hours sometimes just to get away from the house, to avoid the quiet, to avoid the look in Mark's eyes when I caught him trying to explain himself. He was trying to fix it. He promised he would fix it. But there was no fixing what had been broken inside me. The hardest part was the silence. After I confronted him about Sophie, after everything came out, the silence between us was suffocating. There were no arguments, no shouting matches. Mark didn't beg or plead. He just seemed defeated, as though he knew I couldn't forgive him, no matter how many promises he made. I didn't want to hate him. I didn't want to feel like this. I wanted to believe him, to feel the warmth of our past together, but I couldn't. There was a void now, a space between us that couldn't be filled with words or apologies. It wasn't just about what had happened with Sophie. It wasn't even about the fact that he had kept it from me for so long. It was about the way he had made me feel invisible, like I was the one who didn't matter. Like he could disappear into his own world, his own secret life, and I would just be here waiting for him to come back. And I had been waiting for the man I thought I knew to return. But the man I thought I knew wasn't coming back. He had been replaced by someone else. A man who had betrayed me, who had lied to me, and who didn't seem to care that he had broken something inside of me. Mark tried to do the right things. He'd leave his phone out in plain sight. He'd send me constant updates when he went to the store, asking if I needed anything, and sometimes he'd even offer to take Daisy on walks again, as though nothing had changed. But it was too late. I had seen the truth. I had seen the cracks in our relationship, the ways we had grown apart, and it wasn't something that could be fixed by a few kind gestures. And then one night, as I was sitting in bed, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts, I heard Mark's voice again. This time it wasn't him trying to apologize. It wasn't him offering empty promises. He said something that I hadn't expected. He said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can." The raw honesty in his voice took me by surprise. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't pleading for me to give him another chance. He was just acknowledging the damage, the truth that was now hanging between us, unspoken but clear. That was the moment I realized that the part of me that had been holding on to hope, that had wanted to believe we could get past this, had died. There was no going back. There was no fixing what had been broken. The next morning I woke up early, as I often did now. I didn't want to lie in bed, thinking about everything that had happened. I didn't want to be in that space anymore. I took Daisy on our usual walk, but this time, the streets felt different. They felt heavier, like each step I took was leading me farther away from the life I had known, and closer to a new, uncertain future. Daisy trotted along beside me, her tail wagging in that innocent way she always did, oblivious to the turmoil inside me. As I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, Sophie. She had been the catalyst for all of this, but I wasn't sure she was the real problem. No, the real problem was the way Mark had let me slip into the background, the way he had neglected me, emotionally and physically, while seeking solace in someone else. It wasn't about the affair itself, it was about what had led to it. The years of neglect, the hours spent alone while he focused on work, the ways I had quietly, slowly slipped from his radar. I had known it for a while, but I had ignored it. I had convinced myself that things would get better, that we would find our way back to each other. But we hadn't. We never would. I didn't want to make a decision yet. I didn't want to rush into anything. But deep down I knew that things would never be the same. The walks we had taken together, the life we had built. Everything felt like a lie now, even the simplest moments we had shared. I wasn't sure if I would ever forgive him. I wasn't sure if I could. But as I walked with Daisy, the fresh air in my lungs, the early morning silence surrounding me, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep walking in the same direction anymore. I had to change course. The decision didn't come quickly. I wasn't the type to make hasty choices, especially when it came to something as complicated as my marriage. But as the days stretched on, The weight of everything that had happened settled deeper into my chest, suffocating me more and more. Each time I looked at Mark, I didn't see the man I had married. I saw someone who had turned away from me, someone who had chosen a life of secrets, a life I wasn't part of. And in the silence between us, in the strange politeness that had replaced any real connection, I realized that I had been living in a ghost of my own life. The hardest part, though, was the guilt. I had started to question myself. Was I the one who had missed something? Had I not been enough for him? What if I had pushed him away? I thought back to all the times I had been busy with my own life, with work, with friends, but I hadn't neglected him the way he had neglected me. I hadn't been out at night, building another world without him. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed somehow. There were moments when I wanted to confront him, to scream and shout, to throw the truth in his face and demand answers. But when I looked at him, his tired eyes, his slumped shoulders, I found myself unsure. What was I even going to say? What good would it do? He knew what he'd done. I could see it in the way he moved, the way he tried to act normal, as if he were the same person I had married. But I couldn't pretend anymore. He had broken something inside me, and the cracks were too wide to hide. I spent more time outside, walking Daisy, escaping into the familiar comfort of her presence. With every step, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if I was walking on the edge of something, teetering between the life I had known and the one I was about to step into. The evening walks became my only escape, the only time when I could stop thinking about Mark, stop thinking about everything that had gone wrong. There were days when I would find myself lost in the rhythm of Daisy's paws against the pavement, the cool breeze against my face, the sound of distant traffic humming in the background. On those nights, I almost felt normal again. Almost. But the truth always lingered, just beneath the surface, like a shadow following me. Each time I passed the park or the grocery store, or the quiet street where Mark had gone with Sophie, the reality would crash back into my mind. And then there were the moments when I'd start thinking about Sophie, about her and Mark and their secret world. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. She was just an excuse, a distraction, a way for Mark to avoid whatever was wrong between us. But I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. What if they were more than that? What if he had found someone else, someone who didn't make him feel invisible? Someone who listened to him, who saw him the way I used to? I hated myself for thinking about her. Hated the way she had come into our lives, this woman who had made herself so easily important to him, who had managed to carve a place in his world while I had been left behind. She wasn't the enemy, not really. She was just a symptom of something deeper, something broken between Mark and me. But still, I couldn't stop the thoughts from spiraling. One evening, after a particularly long walk with Daisy, I came back to the house to find Mark sitting at the kitchen table. He was flipping through a magazine, his face set in that expression I'd come to recognize, distant, guarded, like he was trying to be somewhere else, anywhere else but with me. I stood in the doorway watching him, my mind swirling with 100 different emotions. Anger, hurt, betrayal. But more than that, sadness. A deep, aching sadness that seemed to consume me whenever I looked at him. He didn't even look up when I walked in. And for a moment, I thought maybe he was trying to avoid talking to me. But then he sighed, set the magazine down, and turned to face me. "I know you're upset," he said, his voice soft, almost too soft, as if he was trying to tiptoe around the mess he had made. "I know I've messed up and I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I want to make things right. I'll do whatever it takes, just tell me what you need." I stood there, frozen, staring at him. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to say that everything would be okay, that we could fix it, that we could start over. But I knew I couldn't say those things anymore. I couldn't pretend. I couldn't act like I hadn't seen the truth. "I don't know if I can believe you," I said, my voice quiet but steady. It wasn't anger that filled me, not at that moment. It was just exhaustion. "I don't know if I can forgive you." He opened his mouth to say something, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "No. Don't. I don't want to hear it. I don't know what to do with any of this anymore. I don't know if I even know who you are anymore." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him there, staring after me. I felt his eyes on my back as I retreated to our bedroom, but I didn't care. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the decision I had to make. I couldn't stay in this limbo, this in-between space where everything felt wrong. I needed to move forward, but I didn't know how. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I didn't know what it would look like, what it would mean for me, for Mark, for Daisy, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep living in a house filled with silence, filled with the ghost of a life that no longer existed. I needed to find myself again. I needed to reclaim who I was, separate from him, separate from all the lies. The next morning, I didn't tell Mark I was going out. I just slipped out of the house with Daisy, as I had so many times before. We walked down the street, the familiar path, the leash in my hand. But this time, as I stepped forward, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. This time, for the first time in a long time, I felt something else, hope. It wasn't a hope that things would magically fix themselves, but a quiet, certain hope that I would be okay. That I could stand on my own no matter what came next. As the days went by, the silence between Mark and me deepened, but I didn't mind. In a strange way, the quiet was comforting. It gave me space, room to breathe and room to think without the constant pressure of his presence. I had started taking longer walks with Daisy, venturing into unfamiliar neighborhoods, exploring streets I had never noticed before. There was something therapeutic about those walks, something grounding. With every step, it felt like I was putting more distance between me and the life I had once known. The walks gave me clarity. The cool evening air, the rhythm of Daisy's paws on the pavement, the distant sounds of the city. Each moment felt like a small escape from the tension of the house. It wasn't just about leaving the house physically. It was about leaving the emotional weight that had started to pull me down. The truth was, I had been living in a fog for so long, not fully seeing what was happening between Mark and me. I had been so focused on what we were, on what we used to be, that I had failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. Mark had tried. He had tried to fix things in his way, offering me promises he couldn't keep, apologizing in the way he thought I wanted him to. But I knew deep down that those apologies weren't enough. They didn't erase the distance that had grown between us. They didn't undo the betrayal. They didn't change the fact that something had broken inside me, something I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. I was still conflicted. Part of me wanted to talk to him, to find a way back to the version of us I had held on to for so long. But another part of me, the part that had started to find peace in the quiet, in the space between us, knew that it was time to let go. The longer I walked, the clearer it became. This wasn't something I could fix. This wasn't something I could ignore or pretend wasn't there. We had drifted apart in ways I couldn't understand, and I couldn't go back. I began spending more time reflecting on my own life. Who was I outside of being a wife? I had spent so many years defining myself by my relationship with Mark that I had forgotten who I was before. I remembered the things I used to love, painting, writing, traveling. I had put those things aside to focus on building a life together, but somewhere along the way I had lost sight of myself. It wasn't just Mark who had neglected me. I had neglected me too. Daisy was my constant. As always, she was by my side, her tail wagging, her eyes bright with excitement. She didn't care about the turmoil in my heart. She only cared about being with me. She was a reminder of simpler times, a reminder of what it meant to love without complications, without betrayal. And as I looked down at her, I realized I had something to hold on to. I didn't have to navigate this journey alone. As the weeks passed, I grew more certain of my decision. I started looking for a new place to live. I wasn't running away from Mark. I was running toward something new, toward freedom, toward rediscovering who I was, and toward building a life I could be proud of. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to let go of the idea of what we had built together. But it was necessary. I wasn't going to be a martyr for a relationship that no longer served me. I had spent too many years letting my needs fall by the wayside, too many years living in the shadow of a man who had, in so many ways, stopped seeing me. I found a small apartment not far from where I had been living. It wasn't much, but it felt like the right place to start over. It was quiet, peaceful, and empty. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control. I wasn't running away from anything anymore. I was taking control of my own life, carving out a space that was mine and mine alone. When I told Mark I was leaving, it wasn't in anger or with spite. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, and it wasn't a tearful goodbye. It was simply the truth. I told him that I needed to go, that I needed to find myself again, and that I couldn't stay in a relationship that had lost its foundation. I saw the sadness in his eyes, the hurt. But there was also a quiet understanding, as though he knew deep down that this was the only way forward for both of us. He didn't fight me. He didn't beg me to stay. He just nodded slowly, as if accepting the inevitable. And just like that, I walked away. The first few days in the new apartment were strange. Everything felt different. The silence was louder, the emptiness more pronounced. But in a way it was a relief. I spent those days settling in, unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and finding a rhythm that was entirely my own. Daisy, ever loyal, was right there beside me, curled up at my feet as I read or worked. I began to rediscover parts of myself I had long forgotten. I started painting again. I took long walks, but now they were my walks. I wasn't walking to escape the tension of a home filled with unspoken words. I was walking because I wanted to, because I was reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried for too long. Months passed and the hurt slowly faded. I still thought about Mark from time to time, but not in the way I used to. The anger and confusion had given way to a kind of acceptance. I realized that we were both better off this way. He had his own journey to navigate, just as I had mine. And Daisy, she was still my constant, my companion through it all. Her loyalty and love never wavered, and she had been my greatest source of comfort during those lonely nights. I knew I wasn't alone, and that was enough. In time I began to build a new life. A life that was mine, where I didn't have to share every part of myself with someone who couldn't appreciate it. A life where I didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. A life where I could finally breathe again, and live on my own terms. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the weight of the past still pressed down on me. There were nights when I still felt the sting of betrayal, when I questioned if I had done the right thing. But those moments were fewer and fewer. Slowly, the pieces of me that had been broken began to heal. And I realized that I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was whole just as I was. And so I walked. Every day I walked. Sometimes with Daisy by my side, sometimes alone. But always forward, always moving toward the life I had claimed for myself. And for the first time in a long time I felt free. The days stretched into weeks and weeks into months. My life, once a collection of routines and half-forgotten dreams, was now a canvas waiting for new strokes of possibility. It wasn't just the physical distance from Mark that had changed things. No, it was more than that. It was the emotional space I had carved out for myself. A space where I could breathe without fear of suffocating under the weight of unspoken tension. It was the discovery of who I was without him, without the constant need to fit into a role that had never really been mine. Every morning, the sunlight streaming through the window of my new apartment felt like a fresh start. The quiet mornings were no longer filled with the anticipation of confrontation or unresolved issues. They were peaceful, with just the soft sounds of birds outside and the hum of the city in the distance. And in those moments I found my balance again. I found a rhythm, a comfort, in the simplicity of everyday life. Daisy had become my anchor, my constant companion in this new chapter. We had grown closer, her presence filling the spaces that had once felt empty. She was a reminder of the beauty in the smallest things, like the way she would sit by the door, tail wagging, waiting for our walks, or the way she would curl up on the couch beside me, her soft fur a reminder that love didn't need to be complicated. It was a steady, unspoken connection that asked for nothing more than loyalty and companionship. I began to trust myself again. I trusted my instincts, my decisions, and my ability to navigate this new life. I started taking longer walks, exploring different parts of the city I had never ventured into before. Sometimes I'd stop at a cafe, read a book, and savor the quiet moments of solitude. Other times I'd walk along the water, watching the waves crash against the shore, feeling the breeze on my face and simply being. There was something liberating about being alone in the world again. It was an odd feeling at first, one I had to get used to, but it became something I could embrace. The freedom to be my own person, to do what I wanted without having to explain myself, was intoxicating. The more I embraced it, the more I realized how much I had given up in the past, how much of myself I had put aside in favor of trying to make a relationship work. It wasn't just Mark who had lost his way. I had too. And it was only when I took a step back that I could see that. Of course, there were moments of doubt. There were days when loneliness crept in, when the absence of Mark's presence in the house felt like a hollow space that I wasn't sure how to fill. But those moments were fleeting. They came and went like passing clouds on a sunny day. I had learned to sit with them, to acknowledge them, and then to move on. I knew now that it was okay to feel the emptiness, it was just a part of the process. One afternoon, as I was walking Daisy through a quiet neighborhood near the park, I passed by a little bookshop that I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away on a corner, its windows filled with colorful displays of old books and trinkets. Something about it caught my attention, and I found myself walking inside, drawn in by the warmth and coziness of the space. The shop was small, but it had a charm that immediately made me feel at home. There were shelves stacked with books of all genres, their spines weathered from years of being opened and read. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers over the books as I went, until I found a small section dedicated to poetry. I had always loved poetry, but it had been so long since I'd allowed myself the luxury of indulging in it. I pulled a book from the shelf and began to read, losing myself in the words. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something akin to joy. It wasn't the kind of joy that comes from external circumstances, but the kind that wells up from deep inside, a recognition that I was reconnecting with myself in ways I hadn't known I needed. The shopkeeper, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled at me from behind the counter. "Take your time," she said, her voice gentle. "Books have a way of healing." I smiled back, grateful for the quiet reassurance in her words. She didn't know my story, but she understood. I lingered for a while, lost in the pages, until the soft afternoon light began to fade and I realized it was time to head home. But before I left, I bought the book, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to carry something of that feeling with me. A reminder that I could still find beauty in the world, even in the aftermath of everything I had been through. That evening, as I curled up on the couch with Daisy at my feet, I opened the book and began to read aloud to her. The words, simple and profound, filled the room with a sense of calm. It was a small, quiet moment, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long while I felt truly content. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had found peace in the imperfections. As the days went on, I continued to rebuild my life one small piece at a time. I started going back to old hobbies I had forgotten, taking evening classes, meeting new people, and learning to enjoy my own company. I didn't need to fill every moment with activity, but I was learning to savor the quiet ones as well. There was no rush, no pressure. Just life unfolding as it was meant to. I began to notice changes within myself, subtle shifts that spoke of growth. I was no longer the person I had been when I was with Mark. I was stronger now, more self-assured, and more aware of my own worth. The fear that had once held me back was slowly replaced by a quiet confidence. I was capable of navigating this new life. I was capable of being happy on my own. Daisy, too, seemed more content. There was a lightness in her step now, a joy in her eyes. I knew she had missed the stability of our old life, but I also knew she had adjusted to the new routine. She was my constant companion, my loyal friend through every twist and turn. I realized that the life I had once feared was not something to be afraid of. It was just another chapter, another step in the journey, and I was learning to embrace it one step at a time. And then one evening, as I walked along the beach with Daisy, feeling the sand between my toes and the cool air on my face, I saw a man in the distance. He was walking slowly, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the water. For a moment I hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But then he turned toward me and I saw his face. It was familiar. His smile, the way he carried himself, even the way his eyes lit up when he saw me. I hadn't expected to see him again. Not like this, not in this place. But there he was. It had been months, and in those months I had changed. But so had he. We had both moved on in our own ways. The past was just that, the past. And though I wasn't sure what would come next, I wasn't afraid to face it anymore. Because in that moment I realized something important. Life doesn't have to make sense. Sometimes the pieces don't fit perfectly. But as long as you keep moving forward, you'll find your way eventually. The moment hung in the air, suspended like the last beat of a song before the silence. I stood still, unsure whether to speak or simply keep walking. My heart was pounding, and yet, there was an odd sense of calm washing over me. The man standing before me, Mark, wasn't the same person I had left behind months ago. He had changed in subtle ways just as I had. His eyes held a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, a kind of understanding that hadn't been there before. He took a step toward me, his expression softening. I didn't expect to see you here, he said, his voice steady but filled with an unfamiliar vulnerability. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. I hadn't expected this either, but here we were. It felt like fate had nudged us into this quiet moment, where time seemed to stretch out indefinitely. The beach was nearly empty, just the rhythmic sound of the waves and the distant calls of seagulls. It was as if the world had paused to give us space, to allow whatever needed to be said to be said. I wasn't sure if I would ever see you again, I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. It felt strange to be so composed when so much had changed, when everything between us had once felt so solid and certain. Mark looked at me for a long moment, his gaze shifting between my face and the waves crashing softly at our feet. I know I hurt you, he said finally, his voice low. I'll never be able to take that back. But I'm sorry. I should have done better. I took a deep breath, allowing his words to settle inside me. The apology wasn't new, but somehow it felt different this time. It wasn't just a collection of words strung together. It was a rawness, an honesty that hadn't been there before. I could see that he had truly changed, not in the way I had hoped when we were together, but in the way people change when they finally realize who they are outside of a relationship. I understood that now because I had gone through that transformation too. I know, I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. And I think I've finally accepted that we can't go back. I can't go back. I needed to find my own way again. Mark's eyes softened, and there was a flicker of something in them. Regret, maybe, or understanding. I'm glad you're doing okay. I've been trying to figure things out too. It's been hard. I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. I could relate. The pain of what we had lost had been heavy for both of us. But there was something else now. Something that wasn't sadness or anger, but a sense of peace, a sense of release. We had both let go of the expectations, the hurt, and the past. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could truly breathe again. We stood there for a while, neither of us saying much. Just being present in that moment, surrounded by the soft murmurs of the world around us. Daisy, sensing the shift, sat quietly by my side, her tail lazily swaying as if she too was taking in the change. I've been thinking a lot about us, I said after a long pause, turning to look at him. About everything that happened, about why things ended the way they did. And I don't think it was anyone's fault. Not really. We just weren't right for each other anymore. I needed something different, something more. Mark nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for me to say that. I understand. I think we both did, even if we didn't know it at the time. I've been trying to understand what went wrong. It wasn't just you. I lost myself too. I smiled faintly, feeling a warmth spread through me. Not because of what he said, but because of the realization that I was finally at peace with everything. The past no longer held the power it once did. It was just a chapter, a memory, a part of a bigger story. And as much as I had loved him, as much as I had mourned what we had, I knew that letting go was the only way forward. Maybe we needed to lose each other to find ourselves again, I said, more to myself than to him. He met my gaze, his eyes thoughtful. Maybe, but I think I'll always remember the good parts. The parts that made it worth it. I will too, I whispered, nodding. And with that I felt a shift inside me. A sense of finality, yes, but also a lightness. It was over, but it didn't have to be ugly. It didn't have to leave scars. It had been a chapter in my life, one that had shaped who I was, but it wasn't the whole story. I'm glad we could talk, I said, breaking the silence. It feels like closure, like we've both moved on. Mark nodded, a quiet understanding passing between us. He took a step back, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer. I hope you keep doing well, he said gently, his voice almost a whisper. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. I smiled softly, grateful for his words, even though they weren't necessary anymore. I had everything I needed. Thank you. I'll be okay. As Mark turned to walk away, I watched him for a moment, the familiar weight of the past lifting slowly, like a fog clearing from the landscape. It wasn't the dramatic ending I had once imagined. No shouting, no anger, no final confrontation. It was simply two people who had shared a part of their lives, and who now could walk away from it with grace. Daisy, as always, stayed by my side, her presence grounding me in the present. We continued our walk along the beach, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over everything. It felt like the start of something new, something full of possibility. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know where this path would lead, or who I would meet along the way. But I didn't need to know. For the first time in a long time, I was okay with the uncertainty. I had learned that life wasn't about having all the answers. It was about moving forward, trusting yourself, and embracing the journey, no matter where it took you. And so I walked. With Daisy by my side and the world ahead of me, I walked one step at a time. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it. The days that followed felt like a continuation of something I had always been waiting for, though I hadn't known it at the time. My steps became lighter, more deliberate, as if I were finally walking the path I had been meant to walk all along. I spent mornings drinking coffee in the park, reading, sometimes even sketching in a notebook I hadn't opened in years. Daisy was always there, her tail wagging as she sniffed around, content in her own way. There was an ease to life now, a rhythm I hadn't realized I was missing until I found it again. I met new people along the way, some of them strangers who didn't ask questions, others who simply smiled as we passed each other by. There was a sense of anonymity in the crowd, a freedom in being one face among many. I didn't have to explain myself, didn't have to justify my choices to anyone. For the first time, I felt like I could just exist without the weight of anyone else's expectations pressing down on me. The evenings were quieter now. I had my small apartment, which had started to feel more like a home with each passing day. The soft lighting, the comfortable furniture, the quiet hum of the city outside my window, it was all mine. The space reflected me, not the version of me I had been when I was with Mark, but the person I had rediscovered in the aftermath of everything. I had become someone different, someone stronger, more certain of who she was and what she wanted. Daisy and I went on longer walks, exploring parts of the city I hadn't even known existed. There was something thrilling about discovering new places, new corners of the world that I hadn't seen before. It was like reclaiming the space that had once been filled with doubt and confusion, now replaced with a quiet confidence. Every new street, every new park bench where we would sit and watch the world go by, felt like a victory. One evening, as I sat on a bench by the river, I noticed a woman sitting alone, sketching the water. Her presence was unassuming, yet there was something about her focus that made me curious. I had always been drawn to artists, to people who could see the world differently, and this woman seemed like one of them. After a moment, I found myself walking toward her, drawn by an inexplicable pull. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, my voice soft but friendly. She looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes a mix of surprise and warmth. "Of course, go ahead," she said, smiling gently as she moved her bag to make room on the bench. "I'm Eva." "Claire," I replied, taking a seat beside her. We both turned to look at the water, the late afternoon light reflecting off its surface. "It's beautiful here," Eva said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "I come here often to draw. There's something about the way the light hits the water. It's calming." I nodded, feeling an unexpected connection in her words. "I know what you mean. It's peaceful, like everything slows down for a while." We talked for a while about art, about the city, about life in general. Eva was easy to talk to, and her presence was comforting in a way I hadn't anticipated. She had an openness about her, a way of listening that made me feel like I could say anything without judgment. By the time the sun began to set, I realized how much time had passed. "It was nice to meet you," I said, standing up from the bench. "I'm glad I sat down here." Eva smiled warmly, packing up her sketchbook. "Me too, Claire. Maybe I'll see you again sometime. If you're ever out here, stop by." "I will," I promised, feeling a little lighter than I had before. "Take care, Eva." As I walked away, Daisy by my side, I realized how much I had changed. I had been afraid to reach out, afraid to make new connections for so long. But now it didn't feel like such a big risk. It felt like an opportunity, a way to keep building the life I was creating for myself. And maybe, just maybe, there were more people like Eva out there, people who understood the beauty of slowing down, of taking the time to see the world for what it was, not for what we wished it would be. Over the next few weeks, I made it a habit to visit the river at least once a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with Daisy. I never knew when I'd run into Eva again, but I didn't mind. It was enough to know that the possibility was there. And sometimes when I sat quietly on the bench, watching the water ripple in the soft evening breeze, I thought about all the things I had left behind, Mark, the past, the version of myself that had been trapped in a cycle of trying to fix things. It wasn't easy to let go of those old patterns, but I had done it. I was finally free. One afternoon, as I was returning from the river, I received an unexpected message. It was from an old friend, someone I hadn't heard from in years. Her name was Lauren, and we had been close in college before life had pulled us in different directions. The message was simple. Hey Claire, it's been a while. I'd love to catch up sometime if you're free. For a moment I hesitated. I hadn't really kept up with anyone from my past, not since everything with Mark had happened. But then I remembered the quiet joy of sitting on the bench by the river, of opening myself up to new possibilities. Maybe it was time to reconnect with old friends, to let the walls I had built around myself start to crumble a little. I typed back quickly, a sense of anticipation bubbling up inside me. I'd love that. Let me know when you're free. Within an hour, we had made plans to meet the following weekend at a cafe in the city. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been so long since I had seen Lauren, and I wasn't sure who I would be when I saw her again. But I was determined to find out. I was determined to take the next step, even if it felt uncertain. The weekend came quickly, and I found myself walking to the cafe, Daisy by my side, my heart beating a little faster than usual. I wasn't the same person I had been when Lauren and I were friends before. But I had a feeling that this meeting would be different. This time, I was meeting her as someone who had learned to embrace her own independence, someone who had rediscovered herself. And somehow, I knew that would make all the difference. When I arrived at the cafe, I saw her sitting at a table near the window, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked just as I remembered, her dark hair a little longer, but her smile the same, wide and inviting. She stood up as I approached, her eyes lighting up in recognition. "Claire," she said, her voice full of warmth. "It's really good to see you." I smiled back, feeling a sense of homecoming that I hadn't expected. "It's good to see you too, Lauren. It's been way too long." We hugged briefly, the kind of hug you give to someone who was once such a big part of your life. As we sat down and began to talk, I realized that this was another step forward, another part of the journey. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew that I was ready to find out. Life, after all, was meant to be lived in the moments, in the connections, in the slow, quiet walks that led to new discoveries. And this was just one more chapter in the story I was writing for myself. As the weeks passed, I found myself more at peace than I had ever been. I had stopped looking back, stopped questioning every choice I made and whether I had taken the right path. Life had a way of unfolding on its own, and I was learning to trust it again. Daisy, my ever-faithful companion, had become my constant source of joy. Our walks became a kind of ritual, a sacred time for reflection and quiet. Sometimes we'd go to the river, other times we'd explore new parks or hidden corners of the city. The world felt expansive in its simplicity. Meeting Lauren again had been a turning point. It had reminded me that connection was possible, even after all the distance and hurt I had felt. Our coffee dates became regular, each conversation more comforting than the last. I hadn't realized how much I had missed these simple, effortless moments of companionship. And as we laughed and caught up, I felt a sense of lightness, a feeling I had long since forgotten. I had also started taking more time for myself, more time to do the things I loved, without the weight of expectations or past mistakes. I picked up painting again, something I had abandoned years ago. It felt like rediscovering a part of myself that had been buried. And as I stood in front of my easel, brush in hand, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I painted landscapes, abstract pieces, whatever came to mind. The canvas was a space where I could let go of everything, where I could simply be. Then one evening, while I was working on a new piece in my living room, Daisy curled up at my feet, I received another message. This time it wasn't from Lauren. It was from Mark. First, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected to hear from him again, especially not after the last conversation we had. I hadn't even thought about him much in the last few months. I opened the message, my fingers trembling slightly as I read it. "I hope you're doing well, Claire. I've been thinking a lot about us lately. I don't expect anything, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry again. I hope you found what you needed. Take care." I stared at the words for a long moment. They weren't much, not really an apology, but something about them felt final. He wasn't asking for anything, no attempt to rekindle what we once had. It was simply his way of acknowledging that we had both moved on. And for a second I felt the weight of the past lift off my shoulders completely. The anger, the sadness, the confusion, they were all gone, leaving nothing but a quiet acceptance. I didn't need to respond. I didn't need closure from him anymore. I had found it on my own, in the quiet moments, in the walks with Daisy, in the new relationships I had formed. I had learned that healing wasn't about waiting for someone else to make things right. It was about doing it yourself. I set my phone down and stood in front of the painting I had been working on. The colors blended together, flowing and chaotic, yet somehow perfect. The image wasn't clear yet, but I could feel it taking shape, a vision I hadn't fully seen until this moment. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely free. There were no loose ends left, no unfinished business. I had learned to trust myself again, to move forward without fear of the past. I wasn't the same person I had been when I started this journey, and I wasn't sure who I would be tomorrow, but that was okay. The beauty was in the becoming, in the constant evolution. With a final glance at my work, I smiled, feeling a peacefulness that I hadn't known in a long time. Daisy stirred at my feet, sensing the shift in the air, and as I bent down to scratch behind her ears, I realized that I was exactly where I was meant to be. And so the story continued. Not in grand dramatic moments, but in the quiet, simple steps I took each day. The journey wasn't over. It had just begun.